Richard Hale had everything money could buy, and almost nothing that money could not. He was 58 years old. He owned 3 companies, a private jet, and a mansion so big that even the people who cleaned it every day still got lost in its hallways. His name was in magazines. His face was on business shows. People said his name like it meant something powerful. But at night, when the big house went quiet, Richard sat alone in his study with a glass of water he never drank, staring at old photos of his wife, who had passed away 6 years earlier. They never had children. And somewhere along the way, all his success had turned into a kind of silence that followed him from room to room. The only real warmth in that huge house came from 2 people, Maria Torres, his housekeeper, and her 3-year-old daughter, Hope. Maria had worked for Richard for almost 2 years. She was a single mother, quiet and hardworking, the kind of woman who noticed everything but said very little. Her husband had left before Hope was even born, and Maria had built her whole world around her daughter. Long bus rides to work, double shifts, and a tiny apartment with a mattress on the floor because she was saving every dollar for Hope's future. Richard had told Maria, more than once, that she didn't need to bring Hope to work. But there was no one else to watch her, and something in Richard, some small piece of the father he never got to be, always said, "It's fine. Let her come." So little Hope grew up half in a cramped apartment, half in a mansion with marble floors and giant windows. She called Richard Mr. Rich because she couldn't say his last name properly, and somehow the nickname made even his security guard smile. Hope was a curious child. She noticed things grown-ups didn't. She would stop in the middle of playing and stare at a painting for a long time, or repeat a phrase she'd heard once, days later, at exactly the right or wrong moment. Maria often laughed and said, "That girl has an old soul stuck in a baby's body." Richard liked having her around more than he ever admitted. Some evenings, exhausted from meetings and numbers and men in suits who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes, he would come home and find Hope sitting cross-legged on his office rug, drawing with crayons on the back of his old memos. He never got angry. He would just sit down next to her on the floor, in his $3,000 suit, and ask her what she was drawing. "A house," she said once. "With you in it. And Mommy. And me." Richard didn't say anything that night. He just looked at the crayon drawing for a long time after Hope had gone home. But that week, something darker was moving through Richard's world, something Hope, Maria, and even Richard himself did not fully understand yet. For months, Richard had been working on the biggest deal of his career, a $250 million investment into a new energy project led by a smooth-talking businessman named Daniel Vance. Vance had shown up a year earlier with polished shoes, a confident smile, and a folder full of numbers that all pointed toward one thing, a golden opportunity that would double Richard's fortune and secure his legacy. Richard's lawyers had reviewed the paperwork. His accountants had checked the numbers. Everyone around him nodded and said the deal looked strong. Vance had impressed the board, impressed the bankers, impressed everyone who mattered. Everyone except one small detail nobody had noticed. That week, Vance had started coming to Richard's house directly, instead of the office, saying it was more private and more efficient. He wanted the final contract signed by Friday, no delays, no more meetings. He kept saying the same thing again and again, with a warm smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Trust me, Richard. This is the deal of a lifetime." Richard wanted to trust him. He wanted, badly, for something in his life to be simple and good and true. He was tired. He missed his wife. He wanted this deal to be the thing that finally made all the hard years worth something. He did not know that if he signed that contract on Friday, he would lose almost everything he had spent 40 years building. He did not know that the answer to the biggest problem of his life was already living in his house, riding in Maria's arms up the marble staircase every morning, humming little songs to herself, watching everything with her big brown eyes. Hope didn't know big words like fraud or investment or contract. She didn't understand money or business or why grown-ups worked so hard and smiled so little. But she understood something else. She understood voices. She understood faces. And 2 days before Vance's contract was supposed to be signed, sealing away $250 million forever, Hope was going to say something so small, so simple, so strange, that it would stop Richard Hale's entire world from falling apart. Nobody knew it yet. Not Richard, drowning in numbers and pressure. Not Maria, quietly mopping floors and worrying about rent. Not even Hope herself, who was simply being a little girl, playing near a door she wasn't supposed to be near, at exactly the right moment in time. Some might call it luck. Others, later, would call it something closer to a miracle. Daniel Vance was the kind of man who never seemed to sweat. He walked into rooms like he owned them. His suits were always freshly pressed, his handshake always firm, his voice always calm and sure. The voice of a man who had never once doubted himself, or at least, never let it show. For the past year, he had been Richard Hale's business partner in what he called the opportunity of the decade, a massive solar and wind energy project stretching across 3 states. Vance said it would provide clean power to millions of homes. He said it would make history. He said Richard's name would be remembered not just as a rich man, but as a man who changed the world. Richard wanted to believe every word. After his wife died, something in Richard had gone quiet. His company still made money. His name was still in the papers. But there was an emptiness that no business deal had ever managed to fill, until Vance came along, talking about legacy, about leaving something behind that mattered. "This isn't just business, Richard," Vance had said at their very first meeting. "This is your story. This is how people will remember you." It worked. Slowly, deal by deal, meeting by meeting, Richard let his guard down. By that Thursday, one day before the final contract was due to be signed, Vance had become almost a regular presence in Richard's home. He came for final walkthroughs of the paperwork, sitting in Richard's study with folders spread across the desk, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone about numbers that all somehow worked out perfectly in Vance's favor. What Richard didn't know was that behind that easy smile, Daniel Vance was drowning. His energy project barely existed. The land deals were fake. The permits were forged. The engineering reports were copied from another company entirely, with the names changed. Vance had spent 2 years building an elaborate lie, one signature at a time, moving from investor to investor, always staying one step ahead of anyone who might ask too many questions. Richard Hale was supposed to be his last big payday, the deal that would let him disappear with $250 million and never be found again. That Thursday afternoon, Vance sat in Richard's study, laptop open, papers spread out like a careful magician setting up his final trick. "I need you to understand something," Vance said, his voice smooth as always. "Tomorrow, once this is signed, the funds transfer immediately. There's a small window, a banking requirement, so once we sign, we move fast. No second thoughts, no delays. Deals like this don't wait." Richard nodded slowly, flipping through pages he barely had the energy to read anymore. He trusted his lawyers. He trusted his team. Mostly, he was just tired of doubting people. Tired of being alone with only numbers for company. "You've done good work, Daniel," Richard said quietly. "I mean that." Vance smiled his perfect smile. "This is going to change everything, Richard. You'll see." He wasn't lying about that part, at least. It was going to change everything, just not in the way Richard thought. While the 2 men talked business in the study, Maria was down the hall, folding laundry in a small sitting room, with Hope playing quietly nearby, stacking wooden blocks into towers and knocking them down again with a satisfied giggle. Hope had always been fascinated by Vance. Not because she liked him. Grown-ups later would remember, looking back, that she had actually always been strangely quiet and still whenever he was around, watching him the way a cat watches a stranger it doesn't quite trust. "Mommy," Hope had asked once, weeks earlier, tugging on Maria's sleeve, "why does that man smile look like Mr. Rich's Halloween mask?" Maria had laughed at the time, thinking it was just a child's strange comparison. "That's not nice, baby. Don't say that." But Hope wasn't trying to be funny. She meant it. Something about Vance's face never sat right with her. The smile that stayed too long, too still, too perfect, like it had been practiced in a mirror instead of felt in the heart. That Thursday, while the men talked in the study, Hope wandered a little too close to the open door, chasing after a wooden block that had rolled away from her tower. She stopped just outside the doorway, small and silent, half hidden behind a large potted plant, and she listened, the way children do, without meaning to eavesdrop, simply because voices are interesting and doors are open. She didn't understand most of what the two men were saying. Big words about transfers and accounts and signatures meant nothing to a 3-year-old. But she understood one thing perfectly. She recognized Vance's voice. Not from this room. Not from this week. From somewhere else. Somewhere she had heard it before, in a different place, saying different words, in a tone that had made her feel scared enough to remember it. Hope's little eyebrows scrunched together. Her wooden block rolled forgotten across the floor. She stood very still, staring at the study door, trying to remember something her 3-year-old mind couldn't fully explain yet. She turned and ran to find her mother, tugging urgently on Maria's skirt. "Mommy," she whispered. "That's the man from the phone. The scary voice man." Maria frowned, only half paying attention as she folded a towel. "What do you mean, baby?" Hope's small face was serious in a way that didn't match her age. "The bad man," she said again. "From Auntie Rosa's phone. He said bad words. He made her cry." Maria's hands slowly stopped moving. She had no idea, not yet, that her daughter had just said the exact sentence that would save Richard Hale's entire fortune. Maria almost brushed it off. Toddler said strange things all the time. Hope was 3 years old. She mixed up dreams and reality, cartoons and real life, often talking about monsters under the bed or friends that didn't exist. It would have been easy, so easy, to smile, pat her daughter's head, and go back to folding laundry. But something about the way Hope said it stopped Maria cold. There was no giggle in her daughter's voice, no dreamy make-believe tone. Hope's small face was pale and serious, her eyes wide with the kind of fear only real memories carry. "Auntie Rosa's phone?" Maria asked carefully, kneeling down to Hope's level. "When, baby? When did you hear this?" Hope thought hard, the way small children do, scrunching her whole face with the effort of remembering. "Before," she said. "At Auntie Rosa's house. The phone was loud. The bad man yelled. Auntie Rosa cried after." Rosa Delgado was Maria's closest friend, another maid who worked 2 streets away for a different wealthy family. The two women had known each other for years, ever since arriving in the city with nothing but suitcases and hope. A few months earlier, Rosa had gone through something painful. She had lost almost all of her retirement savings, nearly $8,000, in what she'd been told was a guaranteed investment opportunity. She never fully explained the details. She was too embarrassed, too heartbroken. She just said a smooth-talking man had promised to double her money, and instead, it disappeared completely, along with the man who took it. Rosa had cried about it only once in Maria's kitchen, while Hope sat nearby playing with a toy truck, seemingly not paying attention. Except children always pay more attention than adults think. Maria's stomach turned cold. "Baby," she said slowly, "can you remember the bad man's voice? Can you show Mommy?" Hope nodded seriously and did something that made every hair on Maria's arm stand up. In a small, careful voice, imitating exactly what she'd heard, Hope said, "Trust me. This is the deal of a lifetime." It was Vance's line, his signature phrase. The very words Maria had heard him say to Richard, again and again, over the past few months, while cleaning near the study. Maria sat frozen on the floor, laundry forgotten in her lap. It could be a coincidence. Children copied phrases from television, from adults, from anywhere. It could mean nothing at all. But Maria had learned, over years of hard work and hard lessons, that a mother's instinct was rarely wrong, and right now, every instinct in her body was screaming. She thought about Richard, upstairs at this very moment, sitting across from Daniel Vance, about to sign away $250 million. She thought about how kind Richard had always been to her and Hope, how he never once made her feel small, even when the rest of the world so often did. She thought about Rosa's tears in her kitchen, about the money that never came back, about a man with a perfect smile. Maria made a decision that many people in her position might never have dared to make. She picked Hope up, walked down the long marble hallway, and knocked on the study door. Richard looked up, mildly surprised. Vance's smile flickered, just for a second, into something colder before smoothing back into place. "Maria," Richard said gently. "Everything okay?" Maria's hands trembled slightly, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Mr. Hale, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I need to tell you something. It's about Hope." Vance let out a small, impatient laugh. "Richard, we really do need to finish this." "It'll just take a moment," Maria said, more firmly than she had ever spoken to anyone in that house before. Richard, sensing something in Maria's face he couldn't quite name, held up a hand toward Vance. "Give us a minute, Daniel." Vance's jaw tightened, but he nodded, forcing his easy smile back into place. "Of course. Take your time." Maria stepped further into the room, Hope held tightly against her hip, and quietly explained everything: Rosa's lost savings, the crying in the kitchen, and the strange, exact phrase her daughter had just repeated word for word. Richard listened in silence, his face unreadable. Across the room, Vance shifted slightly in his chair, his confident posture just barely, almost invisibly, tightening. "She's 3 years old, Maria," Vance said smoothly, though his voice had lost a little of its usual warmth. "Children repeat all kinds of things. It doesn't mean—" "Say it again for me, sweetheart," Richard said quietly, ignoring Vance completely, kneeling down slightly, so he was closer to Hope's height. "Say what the bad man said." Hope looked between the 3 adults, suddenly shy, burying her face briefly in her mother's shoulder. Then, slowly, she peeked back out, looked directly at Vance, and repeated the same line, word for word, in the exact same tone. "Trust me, this is the deal of a lifetime." The room went completely silent. Vance's smile, for the very first time in over a year, disappeared entirely. For a long moment, nobody moved. Richard slowly rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on Daniel Vance. Something had shifted in the room, something small but unmistakable, like the air itself had changed temperature. "That's a strange coincidence," Richard said carefully, watching Vance's face for any flicker of reaction. "A 3-year-old repeating your exact words, from a conversation she says she heard on someone else's phone." Vance forced a laugh, but it came out thin and brittle. "Richard, come on. You're going to let a toddler's imagination interrupt a $250 million deal?" "I'm not interrupting anything yet," Richard said quietly. "I'm just asking questions. That's all." He turned back to Maria. "Tell me about your friend, Rosa. What exactly happened to her money?" Maria, holding Hope close, told him everything she knew: the promised guaranteed returns, the smooth-talking investor who visited Rosa's employer's house months earlier, the $8,000 that vanished along with him, the shame and silence that followed because Rosa was too embarrassed to go to the police over what she feared would sound like her own foolishness. "Do you have a picture of this man?" Richard asked. "Anything at all?" Maria nodded slowly. "Rosa showed me a photo once, from a business card he left behind." Richard didn't wait. He picked up his phone and called Maria's friend directly, putting the call on speaker in front of everyone, including a visibly tense Daniel Vance. Rosa Delgado's voice, when she answered, was warm and a little confused. "Maria? Is everything okay?" "Rosa, I'm so sorry to ask this," Maria said gently, "but can you describe the man who took your investment money? The one who visited a few months ago." There was a pause. Then Rosa described him. Tall, well-dressed, dark hair with gray at the sides, a very charming way of talking, always smiling, always calling everyone friend. She described Daniel Vance perfectly, down to the black leather folder he always carried under one arm, the exact same folder currently sitting closed on Richard's desk. Vance stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to unfounded accusations from a housekeeper and her toddler." "Sit down, Daniel," Richard said, his voice suddenly harder than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "Or don't. But either way, this deal is not being signed today." "Richard, you're making a massive mistake," Vance snapped, his composure finally cracking. "This project is real. The land, the permits. Then you won't mind, Richard said calmly, if my legal team does one more full review before tomorrow. Independently. Starting tonight. Something in Vance's face changed completely. The confident businessman disappeared, and for just a moment, something colder and more desperate showed through. You'll lose the deal, Vance said quickly. The window closes at midnight. This offer disappears forever. Then let it disappear, Richard said quietly. Vance grabbed his folder, his jaw tight, and walked briskly out of the study without another word, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor, his perfect smile gone for good. That night, Richard called his head of legal affairs, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Wu, and asked her to personally investigate every single document in Vance's deal. The land titles, the permits, the engineering reports, all of it. First thing in the morning, before any signature, before any transfer. What she found, working through the night with a small emergency team, was staggering. The land deeds were forged, copied from unrelated public records. The environmental permits were fake, created using a stolen template from a real energy company in another state. The engineering reports had been plagiarized almost word for word from a legitimate project completed years earlier, with names and numbers swapped just enough to avoid an easy search match. Daniel Vance was not a businessman at all. He was a con artist who had spent nearly 2 years building an elaborate, convincing lie, moving from city to city, investor to investor, always vanishing just before anyone got close enough to catch him, until now. By sunrise, Patricia Wu sat across from Richard with a folder of her own, thick with evidence. If you had signed yesterday, she said quietly, the money would have transferred within hours. By the time anyone realized the truth, Vance would have been long gone. Untraceable. We would never have gotten a single dollar back. Richard sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window at the early morning light. $250 million. 40 years of work. Nearly gone. Not because of a mistake in the paperwork, not because of a failed business calculation, but because he had been tired and lonely and wanted so badly to believe in something good. And it had been saved, in the end, not by his lawyers, not by his accountants, not by any of the powerful people who surrounded him every day. It had been saved by a 3-year-old girl named Hope, who noticed a voice that didn't sound right and was brave enough or simply innocent enough to say so. News of Daniel Vance's arrest spread quickly. It turned out Richard had not been his only target. Federal investigators soon connected him to similar schemes in 4 other states, involving nearly $40 million stolen from other unsuspecting investors, including several ordinary families like Rose's who had lost their life savings. Because Richard had refused to sign at the last moment, his legal team was able to freeze several of Vance's accounts before he disappeared completely. In the weeks that followed, some of the stolen money, including every cent of Rose's $8,000, was slowly returned to its rightful owners. But for Richard, the money he saved was never really the most important part of the story. He thought about it constantly in the days afterward, how close he had come to losing everything, not because he'd been careless, but because he had been searching so hard for something to fill the emptiness in his life that he'd let his guard down completely. And how, in the end, it wasn't the smartest lawyer or the sharpest banker who saved him. It was a little girl who simply told the truth. One evening, about 2 weeks after everything had settled, Richard invited Maria and Hope to sit with him in the garden behind the mansion, not as employer and employee, but simply as people. He had made hot chocolate for Hope, badly, in a kitchen he barely knew how to use, and the 3 of them sat together on the stone steps as the sun went down. I owe you both more than I can ever repay, Richard said quietly, watching Hope happily drink her hot chocolate with a milk mustache above her lip. Maria shook her head. You don't owe us anything, Mr. Hale. Hope just said what she remembered. That's all. That's not all, Richard said. That's everything. She trusted her own memory, even though she's just a baby. She wasn't afraid to speak up, even in a room full of grown men in suits. Do you know how rare that is? Most adults I know would have stayed quiet. He looked down at Hope, who was now humming quietly to herself, completely unaware that she had single-handedly saved a $250 million fortune and helped bring a con artist to justice. "I want to do something for her future," Richard said carefully. "For both of you. Not as payment. Nothing could ever really pay you back for this. But because I want to." In the months that followed, Richard set up a full college trust fund for Hope, ensuring that whatever she chose to become one day, money would never stand in her way. He helped Maria move into a small, comfortable house not far from the mansion, one with a real yard where Hope could run and play. He even helped Rosa start a small cleaning business of her own, with a handful of steady clients and, for the first time in years, real financial stability. But more than any of that, something changed inside Richard Hale himself. The big house on the hill didn't feel so empty anymore. Hope's crayon drawings stayed taped to his office wall, right next to his framed business awards, and somehow they meant more to him than any of the plaques ever had. Every evening, when he came home from long meetings, there was a small voice calling Mr. Rich through the hallway and small arms wrapping around his legs in a hug that no amount of money could ever have purchased. Richard often thought back to that afternoon in his study, the moment everything had almost gone wrong. He thought about how easily he could have waved Maria and Hope away, how easily he could have dismissed a toddler's strange words as nothing more than childish imagination. He had chosen instead to listen. And in listening, really listening, to a small voice that the rest of the world might have ignored, he had not only saved his fortune. He had found something he didn't even know he was still looking for, a family sitting quietly in his garden, drinking bad hot chocolate, needing nothing from him except a little bit of kindness and a little bit of time. Years later, when people asked Richard Hale how he built his legacy, he rarely talked about his companies, his investments, or his business deals. Instead, he told them about a rainy Thursday afternoon, a maid's small daughter tugging on her mother's skirt, and 8 simple words that saved everything that truly mattered. That's the man from the phone. The scary voice man. Sometimes, he would say with a soft smile, the smallest voices in the room turn out to be the ones worth listening to the most.